Now, before I tell you the story of Langlitz Leathers, I'm just going to give you a little background on where I come from. I was born in 1948, and when I was about a dozen years old, I was with my dad. He was visiting his brother out in Sandy, and he lives on a farm, the brother does. So we're walking around seeing his garden and all, and I notice in the corner of a shed where he keeps his tractors, there's an old motorcycle there. So oh, they're getting it. So that caught my eye, and I asked my uncle about the motorcycle, and he says, well, that belongs to my son, and I don't know anything about it, and he's not here. So I said, well, if he's interested in selling it, I'd be very interested in finding out about it, maybe buying it. So anyway, a few days later, Rod called me. Oh, thank you. A few days later, Rod called me. Can you hear me better?
Hold it up to your mouth.
Can you hear me now? All right. A few days later, I'm talking to Rod on the phone, and he says, oh, you can have that thing. Really? So I go out, and I get that. I was pretty excited. My first motorcycle, and I'm, I don't know, 11, 12 years old. And I get it home, and it says Harley Davidson on the cases. That gets me pretty excited, I'll tell you. My very first motorcycle is a Harley, and boy, am I living high. Unfortunately, it didn't run, but I worked with a fellow that was a mechanic, and I offered to do his job for half a day while he tried to get this thing running. And he called the Harley shop to get parts and all, and he did manage to get it running. And I learned that a Harley that has a rubber band front end does not have parts available at the Harley shop. It was a 1947 Hummer, but that was my start to motorcycles. Anyway, about 7 years later, I was called on a mission for our church. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has missionaries that they send out. It's commonly known as the Mormon Church. And I ended up in England a couple months later in 1968. Not too much happened other than I was kind of in the central part of England. And I'd been out almost a year, and they transferred me to a place in Wolverhampton. And the guy that I was with was about to come home, but he was a motorcycle nut. When he rode motorcycles back home in Utah, he just couldn't stop talking about it, and all these little Honda 90s and how fast they were. And anyway, it got me excited, so we talked a lot about motorcycles. He even wanted to tour England on his way home, and when he got released, and we went out and looked at an LE. That was my first experience with a British bike, is seeing this LE. It was 10 quid, and that's $24, and it was a runner. Anyway, he said, hey, we're right here in the heart of England. Why don't we go over and see the BSA factory? It's pretty close to us, so yeah, that sounds good. Oh, well, yeah. So we go to see what have we got up there for the slide? Too far. Back up one. There we go. So this was my old companion, Alan Hughie. This is at the BSA factory in the winter of 1968. They had just released the 3-cylinder bikes. So there's a Trident and a Rocket 3 sitting in the front. Interestingly, in this hall, which was probably as big as this is except half the width, there were 2 lines of motorcycles. One was BSA, one was Triumph. And this was what they were really proud of. He said they just got or sent over a test bike into Arizona to see how it would do in the heat. When we actually came up to the factory, it's just a bunch of old buildings, rows of old buildings with narrow, I want to say sidewalks, roads that went between them. There was a guy doing a wheelie on one of these. So that was kind of exciting. Anyway, I got home in 1970, early in 1970, and I mean, after talking to Yugi, I was pretty pumped about getting a motorcycle. So I found a friend that had a Bridgestone 100, and I bought it, and that was pretty neat. I rode that around for a few months. Like this? Okay. Now that I've got this, I don't have to be very close to you. Anyway, so I rode that Bridgestone around quite a bit, and one night I was downtown in Portland on the 4th or 6th, I can't remember what it was, but it was a one-way street with about 4 lanes, and I was like in one of the middle lanes, and on the left-hand side is a guy on a big Harley. And I pulled up alongside him when we were at a stoplight. He looked over at me, and I think I waved at him or something. He says, "Why don't you get a real motorcycle?" So, a couple months later, in fact, I don't even think it was a couple months. I had done a lot of looking in the magazines, and I knew I wanted a shaft drive. And the BMW people said, "Sure, come on out and see them." And I said, "Can I ride one out there?" And they said, "No." I said, we'll drive it, and you can see it. The other dealer had a Moto Guzzi. It had a shaft drive. And they said, "Sure, come on out. You can go for a ride." Anybody remember a motorcycle? Dave Hillis? Where's Dave? Stand up. There's Dave. I bought my first big bike from Dave. It wasn't that Harley. It didn't have a rubber band front end either. Anyway, so excuse me. Anybody remember, what was it called? D&S Cycle in Tigard. Anybody remember that shop? Okay, well, I used to shop at Frank. I lived in Tigard and shopped at Frank's store, and I bought a plastic jacket from him. It was a vinyl jacket. It was $12.95, and it looked like a real motorcycle jacket. It lasted for less than a year before it fell apart. I went back to Frank, and I'm looking at his racks, and he's still got them for sale, but I look up on the wall, and there's a jacket. Dean, if my brother will come up, he's going to be wearing the jacket that was up there on the wall. Frank wanted $40 for it. I said, "Well, you take less?" And he said, "No, $40. And I said, "Well, I can buy a brand new one for $12.95. It's $40. Best $40 I ever spent. This is my brother. After I outgrew this jacket, he wore it for several years. Thank you, Dean.
It still zips up.
Yeah. I kept growing. His growth is stunted, but I kept growing. I went to work for a company that you all heard of before, OMSI, back when it was up by the zoo. And got a job sweeping floors. So I was a janitor, and kind of fun because I could ride my motorcycle in the museum. And I used to give tours to my friends around the museum on the motorcycle and do things that most people couldn't do. But it was fun. There was another guy up there who was also a biker. He had a Sportster, an old CH. So we got to be pretty good buddies, and eventually we went in partners and started a janitorial company. But after a few years, and we used to talk bikes all the time, and we had a great schedule, so I was able to take the Guzzi and go out and do these long trips for a week or two, and he'd do the same. But after a while, we realized that we probably wanted to expand, so we were trying to think of other businesses to get into, and we thought about a burrito business, and motorcycles kind of appealed to both of us, so we started looking at motorcycle shops that were for sale. We found one. There it is. Anybody remember Oregon Motorcycle Parts? Yeah. There were a few people that might remember it. Some of my old customers are here, but we bought that. There were 3 of us. My my janitorial partner, and my brother-in-law, who is sitting back here, Brian Jones. The three of us bought it, and we found how exciting it was to be in a motorcycle business. Made lots of money in the summertime, and when winter got there, the first month it got cold in November, we found that the cost of heating the place was more than we took in for the whole month. So Brian and Dimitri, my other, in fact, some of you may remember Dimitri. He used to work out at the Harley shop as a salesman. But anyway, they decided that maybe the motorcycle business wasn't so exciting in the wintertime. So anyway, I bought them out, and it was my business after that. Step back, thank you. One thing I realized when I was in the motorcycle business is that Portland was a hot spot. There were companies like Arthur Fulmer was just down the street from me, just north of Selwood, Beck Arnley, Haranport, Pacifico, Wheelsport, Tucker Rocky, well, Wheelsport turned into Tucker Rocky, and Cycle Hub, and Langlitz Leathers. And I thought every town had companies like that. Turns out Portland was a kind of a special place. I mean, when you think of all the parts that Cliff had at Cycle Hub, and he's here tonight, I mean, that was a mecca for people that were into British motorcycles. But my entry to the Langlitz family was I'd met Jackie, and I was a customer of Langlitz Leathers. You know, I just thought that was normal, that every town would have a Langlitz Leathers, but they didn't. And I would start playing volleyball with her, and eventually, yeah, we married. Okay, so after we got married, Jackie asked me to come to work for them, and Ross taught me the things that he did, because he employed people to do the cutting and the sewing, but he did a bunch of odd jobs, making mitts and muffs and lap aprons, things that the regular employees didn't do, but Ross did. And that's kind of what I learned so that he could someday retire. Now, there's a picture of Ross. By the way, how many remember Ross? How many actually dealt with him? He died 20 years ago, but a lot of us dealt with him. And one of my early experiences, after I'd bought this jacket, and I bought several other garments from him also, and one day I was in there looking at his catalog, and I'm thinking, boy, that's an old funky catalog. And I said, Ross, I've got one complaint. He says, what's that? I says, well, this is an old catalog, and who's this fuddy-duddy you've got wearing these leathers, you know? He said, that's me. So, fine way to start a relationship, but that was before I married Jackie. Ross really was a nice guy. He was born in Idaho to a Bernice Burgess. When he was a little child, she lost her husband and ended up marrying a guy by the name of Langlitz, Dan Langlitz, who lived in Wilsonville. She moved to Wilsonville, and Dan adopted Ross, so he was no longer a Burgess, but he was a Langlitz at that point. The problem was Dan and Bernice, his wife, were very religious, and Ross had a thing against falling into the norms of religion, so to speak. He was kind of a wild child, in fact. So there was always this constant struggle between him and his folks. But Ross loved motorcycles and rode as a kid, and even married a woman who rode, but we'll get to that in a bit. But one day Ross was riding with another friend, an old friend of his, Roy, They were out in Vernonia, and it was at night, late at night, and a truck backed out of a driveway without its lights on, driven by a drunk, hit both bikes, and Ross lost his leg. He lost his right leg. I've got to think. Lost his left leg. No, he lost his right leg, I think. I never looked. Anyway, Roy lost his leg too, but they didn't cut it off. But Ross's did. They took it off. And the doctor, he was spent 9 months in the hospital. The doctor said he would never ride again. When they turned him loose, the first thing he did is he managed to get his bike started, rode back to the hospital, and parked it up against a bush near the wall, and hobbled in to point out to the doctor that he was wrong. He was going to ride again. But that's the kind of biker he was. Now, before the war, and remember, he was missing a leg. He worked at various jobs, but one of them is he got a job down at the Harley shop in Phoenix. And he told me a story one day. He was playing with a knife. He had a knife and he's throwing it. He had his feet up on a log, sitting in a chair, throwing the knife into the log between his feet, just sticking it. And he said there was an old Indian watching him, and he just repeatedly kept throwing this knife and sticking it in the log, and then he moved it over and stuck it right in his foot. Pulled the knife out and kept doing it. So the Indian didn't say anything. He just got big eyes and left. Now, he worked for the 3 C's and then went to work for Oregon Glove as a supervisor during the war, as he couldn't be drafted at that point. But he learned working leather at Portland Glove, I'm sorry. And that's where he got the background. He started doing things with goat skin, which was kind of uncommon, but goat skin was used for gloves. All of a sudden I'm having a brain stoppage here. We ran into Pinky, and she was riding her own bike. And we got, there's another 2 pictures of Pinky. She was a biker, and she thought he was an arrogant a-hole, to put it mildly, because he was always doing these weird things. But somehow they connected and seemed pretty happy together and got married. And there should be a picture. There they are, there. 1944, October, when they got married. I remember the war was still going on. Ross was still working, but he wanted a motorcycle jacket, so he ordered one, mail order. And I think he said it came out of California. When he got it, it just wasn't what he expected. It didn't fit right, didn't work right, but he had all this experience working with gloves, and so he started playing around with it and got it working better, and then he realized he could probably do a better job himself. So he built his own jacket in the basement, which we probably have a picture of it, yeah. There's his first jacket. From that, his friends started seeing that stuff and started wanting them, so he started building things in his basement for all of his buddies. I asked him how many he thought he had made, was it a couple hundred? And he said, yeah, that's probably about it. I don't know if it was really a couple hundred. That's a lot of jackets, but he built a lot in his basement. Those jackets are pretty rare now, obviously. But in 1947, he decided to open his own shop, hired 3 ladies. He opened the shop over on Burnside, 17th and Burnside, where there was a Culbertson Leather Company, if anybody remembers. There were he and the 3 seamstresses, and they built jackets for several years there. Now, I told you that Ross was a real bike enthusiast. He had 2 Crockers end up in his garage one summer that were in baskets. Yeah. He always he was well connected with the industry. He had some friends that were into motorcycles. One of them, Doug Rambo, you might have heard of, who had Western Distributing. And that's his place, yes. That's right. So anyway, Ross, every time a new bike came out that appealed to him, he bought one. And there was Monty Shelton. Mort Becker was another one that was in Sidewinders. But these guys were all connected, and Ross was somewhat connected too. But he liked cars. Motorcycles weren't his only downfall. He liked cars. He had a Crosley Hot Shot. He had a couple Porsches, a 356 and a 911. There's the 911. That's owned by the fellow sitting here at this table. And BMW, Jag, Tornado. Now in 1947, when he'd opened the business, this is one of those early jackets. This is his first label. Oops, I don't know if you can hear me. But this is one of those jackets from 1947 to early 1948. This is actually elk. And it wasn't a very good material because it's like a sponge. But he didn't know, you know, he built jackets however people wanted them, and he learned what worked and what didn't. One of the biggest mistakes he made was, mistake is the wrong way of putting it.
Experiment.
Experiment, yeah. I mean, he was learning. And for an early jacket, if you look at this and compare it to a modern jacket that we make, there's not a lot of differences. But the worst experience he had, and I want to call it a mistake, but somebody wanted him to make a pigskin jacket. He made two of them, one for this guy and one for his buddy, and they kept stretching, and we kept taking them in, and it was, he finally said, "I'll never do that again." So I've had several pigskin wallets over the years. That lasts about 25 years before I have to build another one, and I'm out of pigskin. Okay. Well, at Culbertson's, Ross had bought this, let's see what picture we have. Number 13. Let's go to the next picture. Yeah, there's Culbertson's with his 1947 Velo. And that was a KSS. 1948 was the last year for them. Do you have the next slide, please? Oh, I think I'm ahead. I'm sorry. In 1953, he got some good coverage in a magazine called Motorcyclists. It was around back then. And the orders started pouring in from Europe and wherever, and he was pretty happy, but they gave him really good coverage. The article was called The Motorcyclist Tailor. He had a green label jacket in 1950. This is an example of a green label jacket. And a green label, the original, whoops, I think it's on the other side on this one. There's the label. I don't know if you can see it, but there's no motorcycles on it, just Langlitz leathers. Just the Langlitz leathers. Originally, he was hand stamping them, so he had a bolt of cloth, and he would ink up his stamp, put it down, and it said Speedway Togs. But he changed the name to Langlitz Leathers, and in 1950 they started producing these woven labels, of which that's an example of one, but it didn't have the motorcycles. And we used that until about 1956, when you could get motorcycles woven. Did you show, oh, that's, sorry, I'm confused here. times were similar back then as they are now, because you do real good at certain times of the year, springtime and fall, not so good in the heat of the summer. So he used to, when it got hot and warm, to earn money, he used to commercially fish down at Depot Bay. In fact, that's a picture of Ross with his boat. Now, his accountant told him not to buy a building. He wasn't in the real estate business. He was in the motorcycle jacket business, you know, the leathers business, and he didn't need to buy a place. But Culbertsons decided they needed their basement for something else, so they gave him the boot. He moved down to 7th and Morrison on the east side, and was there for, a number of years, but the accountant told him the same thing. He says, you know, don't buy a building, just rent. You know, you're in the leather business. Well, they booted him out of there because they wanted that room for something else. So he ended up at 82nd and Stark, and I assume that's a picture of the shop out there. Anybody know what that is? Was there, yes? What was it, you know? That's the banquet room for Chinese Village. They wanted him to move again. So in 1971, he quit listening to the accountant, and he bought the place at 25th and Division. It was called Howard's Tavern Supply. And that is the place we still exist at, because he bought it. We don't rent it.
What year was that?
That was 1971. They remodeled it, and it probably looks like that now. Yeah. Few of you have been there. The golden era of motorcycle jackets, so to speak, was back in the 70s when the Honda started selling millions of bikes. People started thinking of protection, and Ross was always one to encourage people to buy black leathers. Black had a lot of advantages that colors didn't have, but in the 70s there were a lot of jackets sold that looked kind of like this. This is an example of a jacket from the 70s, and this one isn't highly adorned, but some were, but more colorful. Still had the problems though, and Ross still recommended the black. In 1971, Jackie was working at Norm Thompson's out in northwest Portland, and Ross was thinking about retirement and decided to ask her if she wanted to come to work for him. And she did. She said she'd try it out and see how it worked. So, if you notice, that picture on the upper left, the kid standing on the chair, that's Jackie. Okay? And I'm getting warm, so I'm going to take off my shirt. Now there's some other shirts. Taka, you want to stand up? And there's a picture of Jackie on that shirt. You want to point that out? Right in the middle, the chest high, there's a picture of Jackie on it. I've even got a picture of Jackie on my shirt. She was going to be here, and I was going to introduce her and have her stand with her jacket that she was wearing when she was standing on that chair. Thank you. There's Jackie's jacket. Now this one was made in 1949. Amazingly, we've got her sister's jacket, which was made in 1945, and that's the oldest Langlitz jacket we know of. That's currently on exhibit in a museum down in LA. But anyway, there's an interesting story that goes along with how we got that, but I shan't be telling it to you. We'll be here all night. Now, Ross's last bike was a 1967 Honda Superhawk, and I think, do you want to move the, I think that's what's on the wall. That's still down at the shop, out on the wall, on the ceiling. If anybody wants to see it, it's down there. It only has, I think it was 738 miles on it. And all of the bikes that he had, he tore certain parts off, like the seat and the gas tank, and changed them to suit himself. And he changed the controls. So the controls are on the right-hand side of that bike. So he could operate it. Yeah, wow. If you think about that. And there's lots of stories about him and that leg, and they used to do lots of competitive riding out in the Tules and Hare and Hounds and what have you. And his leg would get turned around, and you know, he didn't know it, but make the people sick that ran into it.
What competitive advantage!
Gypsy tours, they would throw some ketchup on it and pitch it out on the street. So it was always good for a laugh.
Have you got a picture of him on the beach?
It's coming up. You'll see it, I think. He did a lot of recreational fishing. He loved fishing and CB, made model planes. There's one he made for me. He did a lot of stuff like that. He liked working with his hands. He was quite good with his hands, and he was quite lovable, so to speak. He made friends with everybody. You about to say something, Chuck? I can't hear you.
That's the beach picture.
Oh yeah, that's down at the beach. That's where he lived.
There.
Yeah, but there he is throwing up some sand. He liked to slide on the beach. We got several pictures of him doing that. He was also, and probably a lot of you know this, he was very competitive, a very competitive trap shooter. He loved to shoot, and here's an example of the vest that he wore, that he made. And not necessarily a good product in terms of, you know, being commercially viable on the market. They've got all kinds of new stuff, but this was his. This is what he wore. Anyway. He sold lots of trap stuff to pay for his hobby. So that's why we sold powder and reloading gear and what have you for many years. When I got there, it was kind of the tail end of it. I think we had a few things left over that I remember selling, but he'd quit ordering powder, and they used to bring in the 40-foot semis and put powder in the back room. We had a slide, you know, wooden slides, so they get it through the window, and I'm just glad I wasn't part of that. Oh, and shot. Not just powder. It wasn't like the whole thing was loaded with powder, but sold lots of shot, and shot is heavy. Ross continued riding up until the 1960s. You saw him sliding the bike down at the Peter. Oh, there's the Peter Iredale. Not much of it left nowadays, but that's, you know, pretty neat back in the 50s, 60s. That's his friend Mort Becker standing next to him. Ross is the one on the left. I'm sorry, Ross. I can't tell from that picture, but I think Ross is on the left. Mort's on the right. Oh, he's on the right? Okay. My eyes aren't very good. Okay. Well, as I'd mentioned before, by the early 70s, Ross was pondering his retirement options, and he hired Jackie from Norm Thompson's. Do you have a picture of Jackie? This is what she looked like back then. Now, Pinky went to work in the office. She kept track of the books. Ross cut, and Jackie was a cutter also. Interestingly, before Jackie got there, back in the 50s and 60s, this is not known by a lot of people, but Ross would get there early in the morning and cut so that his seamstresses would have something to sew. He would go home at 5 o'clock, have dinner. After dinner, he'd go back to the shop and cut again. And did that day after day after day, well, 5 days a week, so that the seamstresses would have something to sew. So anyway, when Jackie went to work for him, she did the cutting as well, and it made life a little easier on Ross. Pinky, like I said, worked in the office. She was there when I went to work there in '81. I was working with customers. Like I said, my job was to do the jobs that he did that nobody else did, the oddball things like making the mitts and the muffs and the lap aprons. I worked with customers, I did shipping. Pinky used to do some shipping too. And I did some office work, but I didn't like manual typewriters. They had an old Remington typewriter. When I finally got to the office, that was the first thing I got rid of, was the old manual typewriter. So, and now we've got the modern computers and what have you, but we don't have an answering machine, and if you call the shop, you'll never get an answering machine unless we're on vacation or something, but somebody answers the phone and deals with you. If it's busy, that's because we're busy. I also learned to repair machinery and do building maintenance. Ross didn't do so well climbing ladders, and especially as he got older, so I got to spend a lot of time on the roof. Ordering materials, it's always a big job. A lot of people have no concept of the materials it takes to make a product like a jacket, but that's one of the things I learned from him. Ross's philosophy was that he wanted to do mail orders of high quality, mail order leathers of high quality, low volume, and offer good customer service. We've endeavored to do that through the years. We've somewhat restricted growth. I mean, when times are good, people say, well, why don't you expand? One time we got some good press and we were backlogged 20 months. That's a great time to expand. Go get in debt. But you can expand when the economy's going up, but the economy eventually does this, and if you're still expanding, you can get in trouble. So we wisely took Ross's advice and kept it on a level plane. I did add a couple sewing machines and a cutting table. Those were things that were easy to do, and we had the room for them. If you go there now, those tables are all there, and it's getting rather crowded, but that was my contribution to expanding, I guess. But we hired a couple more seamstresses, and we ended up with room for 6 full-time seamstresses and a couple extra machines to do other things with. Because sometimes your machines break, and you don't want to have a seamstress sitting around twiddling her thumbs, so they can go to another machine. Plus we do a lot of repairs, so we keep one person busy just doing repairs mainly. In, what year was it? 1984, I think. We got that picture? Okay. Ross and Pinky had their 40th wedding anniversary. Flip the picture.
Really?
Yeah. Unbeknownst to Ross, somebody came into the shop one day and said, hey, I've got Ross's old bike. So we bought it and gave it to him for his birthday, which he was not riding at that point, but that's a shot of him on the 1948 Velo. That's the last KSS Velo that they made, and that was the last one he bought. This was his second one. This was really his favorite bike, I think. He loved the old Velo KSSs. The next shot should show it hanging from the ceiling. That's still at the shop if you want to see it. This is not quite the way that Ross wrote it, but it's close. Now over the years we've had some pretty good press. Wall Street Journal was probably the biggest one that we had. That's the one that backlogged us 20 months. That's big. And I had no idea that it was going to be that big. But we've had a lot of press over the years, and usually, you know, you get 15, 20 people that call after something's been published. But this one, we took one of our cutters and put her on a telephone for 3 days, just taking orders. We still sell jackets off that article. I think that's the Wall Street Journal in the middle. And, after that, we had 1 year when 3 airlines, each one had an article about us. We've had the most recent one, or one of the most recent ones, is one called Sense. And it's about a 5 or 6 page article, and I'll discuss that at the end of this presentation. But I've got a story to tell you about John, who isn't here tonight. He had a birthday party to go to, but he was hired 14, 15 years ago, originally to take my place someday. It didn't happen, but anyway, he'd been working there 3 or 4 months, 5 months, I can't remember. And one day it was kind of quiet. It was in the summertime, and I had to make an errand, go out and pick up something at a supplier. And on the way back, I thought, well, I'll grab a hamburger and get back to the shop, and John's measuring somebody. And we, you know, when we have a new employee that we want to learn measuring, we have them practice on ourselves, our employees, and what have you. And eventually, when they have to measure a real customer, they've got somebody standing right behind them making sure it fits and what have you. Well, John's standing there measuring a customer, and I'm getting back with lunch, and I'm thinking, I can't just jump into the middle of that one. Said, well, at the worst, if it doesn't fit, we'll just make him another jacket, no big deal. So I went back, and I was eating my lunch, and pretty soon the customer left, and John came back, and he was really excited. Do you know who that was? And I said, no, who was it? That's who it was.
Who is it?
Rowdy Piper. Roddy Piper. If you just search for Piper, you'll see that jacket on lots of websites. It was his first measure, and Roddy seemed to be pretty happy with it. So, okay. Well, over the years, we've had lots of customers, some of them fairly big-time customers, the first one being Clark Gable. My favorite was Andy Devine, and these were people that were ordering from us before I got there, certainly. But Benicio del Toro bought half dozen jackets. He was there when I was there. Neil Young ended up buying about 90 jackets. Yeah, and these were for a couple of his tour groups, his garage tours. Ed O'Neill is one of my favorites. Anybody know who Ed O'Neill is? Married with children? Nice guy. And unfortunately, about 3.5 years ago, I had a stroke just when he was getting his first jacket. But every time he called and I answered the phone, as soon as he said something, I'd just start laughing. I had to apologize to him because, you know, I could still visualize him on TV. And anyway. Who else? Keenan Wynn's another big one. That was before my time. Yeah. And by the way, I'm mentioning a few here that are going to ring out to you fellas, but and folks. There were a lot that, you know, that I could mention that are really big actors. But Jay Leno's been in the shop. Jay Leno's been in my house. Another big one, which you probably won't remember, is David Mamet. Does that ring a bell with anybody? He's a big producer. Anyway. Pardon me?
Elvis Presley.
No, not that I know of anyway. I haven't seen any pictures of him in ours. Here's one. I was I was flipping through the channels like 20 years ago. He was on Letterman wearing our jacket. And this is a magazine that was published. Yeah, Bruce Willis has one, and Anybody know Ralph Lauren? This magazine is just from a couple months ago. Yeah. He according to his assistant, his personal assistant, he's very attached to that jacket, and they needed to get the front zipper replaced. The assistant flew out to Portland, waited while we did it, and took it back. He says, that jacket isn't going out of his sight. And that's not uncommon, by the way. We have a lot of people that get repairs done while they wait. Well, we had a lot of European customers in the 40s, a lot of Canadian, British, basically English-speaking people were ordering jackets. Then we started having Asian orders from Thailand, Nepal, China, Taiwan, etc., but just spotty orders. And the Japanese, interestingly, came in 1989. There were a couple guys that came in on a boat. There was a training boat for Japanese sailors, and first boat in Portland from Japan since the war. So it was kind of a big deal at the time. Two of the guys came into the shop, and I got to chat with them. They spoke English, and I spent a couple days with them, taking them up the gorge and what have you. And when they went to leave, they bought a couple $1,000s worth of leathers, which was pretty impressive back then. And then another company came to us, which I presume saw these. They came to us in about 90 or 91. Started picking stuff off the shelf and made a pile. And there was, I don't know, $10,000 or so, but enough to open your eyes back in those days. And anyway, they came back 3 or 4 months later, did it again. Thinking, this is pretty good. You know, they're just buying all kinds of stuff right off the shelf. Third time they came back, they placed an order for 18 or so custom jackets, which we made, sent them a letter, and said they're done. Never heard from them again. That was kind of peculiar. But we sold the jackets to other people, and later I run across one of the guys that was in that company and said they basically went bust. But and he apologized. On those, we didn't. You know, usually we take, back then we took a $50 deposit. Now I think it's $100. We were never into taking big deposits. Just a nominal deposit. And if you didn't buy it, not a problem. We'll just sell it to somebody else. About 90 or 91, another, I'm sorry, not 90, 91, that's the one we just covered. But after this, we started getting lots of orders from various, what I would call trading companies. Most of them in the United States, New York, California, Texas. Names like Orange Point, Scarecrow, Limousine, just a number of companies. But we knew that they were Japanese, and they were basically order takers, and they were taking orders from Japan, and then they'd call us and say, we want to buy whatever. So we'd send it to them. And it got to be a little bit of a problem, because we were sending out a lot of stuff and not knowing where it was going or how it was being sold. About in 93 or so, I would say, there was a guy that had a little company called Vintage Blue in Japan who came over to see us, and he got to Portland, came to our door, knocked on it. We're closed for vacation for 2 weeks. And he didn't speak much English, but he knew enough that next year he came back and did it again, and we were closed again. So he came, well, getting kind of ahead of my story because we realized that we were sending so much stuff to Japan, and one year I think we were probably in the neighborhood of upwards of 50,000 t-shirts alone. And we weren't really knowing where they were going. So there was a friend now, but a fellow who was Japanese who used to come into the shop and buy things from us, and same thing, he was taking orders from Japan, sending them over. And his name was Joe. Joe, do you mind standing? This is Joe. Oh, and by the way, I talked about knockoffs. We're going to back up a bit because this was one of the problems we were having, that we knew we were having, but we didn't know what to do about it. This is a knockoff t-shirt made in Asia. That's one of our calendars, and the story that went with this t-shirt, it was sold on the internet, but there was no way it could be true, and it's definitely not our shirt, but that's a knockoff. This was typical of the problems. So I took Joe and I said, hey, Joe, can I talk to you for a minute in the back? And so we discussed it, and I said, I've got all this stuff going to Japan, and it's a big mess. And he had warned me that someday I would get into trouble with this, and the time had come. So we decided that the best way to handle it was to choose a distributor. And from all the Japanese people I knew, remember the one I was telling you from Vintage Blue, he didn't speak a lot of English at that time, but his name was Takanori. This is Takanori. He's a true Langlitz enthusiast. And if you'll stand, Taka. We suggested that he become our distributor for Japan and take this load of grief that I was facing, and he's dealt with it. He's taken the lead and solved all these problems, and when there is a problem, he's the guy that takes care of it. Even had me come over once. I don't think it was for this t-shirt, but another one that I had to go over and do a deposition for the police in one of the cities. But over there, the police take this stuff very seriously. If you're knocking something off, they do something about it. It's an island, and you get lots of imports, and they don't like knockoffs any better than the manufacturers do, the retailers. So anyway, they come down with a real firm hand on people that do that. Well, Taka had this small distributing company, and he was responsible for everything that happened in Japan under our name. He cut out the nonsense. He created a dealer network. At one time we had over 50 dealers. Now I think we're down to about 24 dealers. But more importantly, he opened 2 Langlitz only shops, which, stand back. Can you turn the picture? Thank you. That's Langlitz Nagoya. There's also one in Tokyo. But that was our first Langlitz only shop, which when you go in there, the only thing you find for sale is Langlitz products. So there's lots of things that we do. You know, you've probably seen some of the sweaters around and what have you. We do gun purses and just oddball things that appeal to the Japanese that, you know, don't really appeal to a lot of other people, but we keep an employee busy just sewing for those shops. Now, to solve the production problem, half of our production is made for our custom customers, or our mail order customers, and half is made for people that just walk in off the street, want a jacket or pants, and they want it right now. They don't want to wait several months for it. So we do all the Japanese orders out of that stock half of the production. so we don't mess up our production to our regular customers. Now, I've spent about 2 decades touring Japan. I went a couple dozen times. You flip the, there. This is one of the rallies that Takas puts on every fall in Japan, where a bunch of the Japanese riders go out in the woods and camp out for a night or two. Go to the next. Oh, this particular one is a campground, and I've only got one teepee, but there's about a dozen of these teepees, and they're pretty nice teepees. You're not sleeping on a dirt floor, sleeping on a wood floor. Anyway, they're pretty fancy. That was a lot of fun. At this rally, let's see, we, just basically sit around and tell stories and enjoy it. It's a family affair. It's not a hardcore biker affair, but most of the guys ride bikes to it. Now the next picture is a picture of a typical dealer. This is called Pirates. This is one that I visited, half dozen years ago. This is the inside of it. This is not a particularly big dealer. We've got dealers that when you walk in, all you see is Langlitz for the most part. I mean, they're really almost Langlitz only stores. But this is a typical dealer, and there's the street. The shop is actually on the left. Now, why am I showing you that? Because that no longer exists. That was taken out by the tsunami. All wiped away. His landlord had some other property, and he's reopened, and he's still in business. But everything you saw there is now gone, including that street. And Japan is kind of an interesting place to visit. This is typical of what you find in a restaurant. I don't know if you can see what that is, but those are eels. And many of the restaurants have food displayed at the door, so you know before you go in what you're going to get. But those are particularly interesting because I don't know if the gills lit up, whatever they are, the portholes, but I just found it interesting. And I've eaten all this food, including raw horse meat, snake, you name it. It's quite an experience eating at restaurants there. And of course, they always treated me the very best. Marvelous meals, but we could spend hours speaking about it. Now, Japan is a motorcycle haven. There are motorcycles everywhere. Part of that is because there's not room to park cars. In Tokyo, you can't have a car unless you can prove you've got a place to park it, but you can have a motorcycle. This motorcycle is nothing special in terms of, it's just a pedestrian scooter. What makes it interesting, if you notice on the back is a gizmo that you hang a pot of soup. So a restaurant would hang their soup on the back, and when they're trying to deliver it, it doesn't spill. And there are just unusual motorcycles everywhere. Some of them have roofs on them. Again, they're almost like scooters with a roof on it. But if you stand even on a rainy day on the street corner, stand there for 5 or 10 minutes and you'll see maybe 100 motorcycles go by. They're not necessarily fair weather riders. Well, after our kids graduated from high school, we moved to a retirement home down at the beach. And Jackie retired, semi-retired, about 8 years ago when the kids got out of school. By the way, this was my daughter that you've seen earlier. But 3.5 years ago, as I said, I had a stroke and had to retire. So we both live down there now. But it's just a few miles from where Ross and Pinky lived until they died. Now, Judy started her career at the shop. Oh, no, better talk about employees. Did we miss a? Okay.
No, that's it.
Okay, well, she started her career at the shop when she was a little kid, and I thought we had a picture of it. We may find it later. But she and her brother are standing next to a motorcycle in their leathers when she was about 3 years old. Now this picture that you're looking at is half of our seamstresses, of which this half happens to be here. You three want to stand up? The other three could not make it tonight. We have 2 cutters, they couldn't make it either. 2 full-time cutters, I should say. There's another couple tables that we cut various things on, but the next picture should show the cutters. Yeah, back up one. That's Coda and Marcus. And then the next picture, these are what we call the bats, the boys at the shop. And they pretty much run the shop in our absence, of which one of those is here. Benny, do you want to stand? One's down in California and the other one's at a birthday party tonight. But I'm missing the page that talks about, well, let's have the next picture. This is Benny. Remember the article I mentioned to you that came out 2 months ago in Sense? That's a full-page shot of Benny in a kind of a neat pose. But we really get a lot of coverage, both on TV, radio. We were on Radio Free Europe, the shortwave bands, a few years back. And this is one of the latest things. Turn to the next photo.
There it is.
Oh, there, it did pop up. There's Judy. So,
Well, you should have told me that was in here. I would have brought my jacket.
never occurred to me. She has that jacket. Okay, go to the next one. Well, Jackie and I retired, and that's Jackie up in the right-hand corner. And Judy's kind of taking her place. So we thank you for the opportunity of telling you our story. And I brought a number of items, which if you want a calendar, we've got some stickers, calendars, and catalogs if anybody's interested. But that's Ross. Our latest calendars, I've got quite a few of them, so feel free to come up and grab them. Now, do you have any questions? No questions?
Coupon for being here?
Yeah, give it to the guy at the door, and next year when you come, you'll get your meal for twice the price. Is there another question?
Do you still have plenty of goat skin available?
We do, although it's spotty. About a month ago, we were having a really hard time getting goat skin. And that's the nature of leather. The tanneries are typical salesmen that will tell you anything to get you off the phone. And yeah, I'm going to ship, a ton of it tomorrow. And you call back 2 weeks later, where's my leather? Oh, we'll ship it tomorrow. That's the nature. But right now, I just talked to them yesterday or 2 days ago, and they've got enough, but they're running low again. So whether or not we'll get a delivery is another story. Another question, yes?
Do you do repairs in Japan?
Do we do repairs for Japan? Yes.
In Japan.
Oh, in Japan?
Yeah, can I go to Japan, get a wreck, and get repaired?
Taka has a sewing machine there.
Okay.
And simple repairs they can probably do, like fixing a zipper, but if you really tear it up, you need to send it back, which Taka takes care of that. If you're in Japan and have a problem, you can take it to Taka and he'll take care of it. Any other? Yes?
So what's your backlog right now?
When I talked to him 2 days ago, it was just a month or month and a half. Great.
Ross had a lot of bikes and you had a lot of bikes. We're all in bikes.
Well, I'd like to blame my wife, but I'm down to maybe one. Yeah. I just sold Mark one recently. I've sold most of my bikes off. At one time I had, well, when I got married, I had over 50. But we've got a couple of them hanging from the ceiling at the shop, and so you can see a couple of them anyway. Yes?
Is the jacket good for more than one crash? You can tire it after that.
The jackets are good for as long as you want to wear them. And usually we can fix them up and make them work again, but sometimes it's not worth it. In other words, you could spend $300 or $400 trying to patch up a jacket that's been cut off you. Because when they cut, the paramedics use a pair of scissors, that makes the jacket 1 inch smaller. So we can add a piece in between them and make it work if you're really attached to it. But usually the insurance companies, don't fool around with it. They just buy you a new jacket. But if you want to keep wearing a jacket, you can wear them. I don't want to say forever, but forever is a long time. But keep patching them up. But realistically, if you wore a jacket every day within a couple dozen years, you'd probably wear it out to where it's not worth fixing. Questions? Yes?
What kind of a bike was on the honeymoon sidecar?
That was a Vincent Comet, 1950. The sidecar was made in 56 by Busmar. And it was a double adult. At one time I had 2 ladies and 4 kids and myself on that. I gave them a ride around the block. It was a lot bigger inside than it looked.
Does that mean you don't ride anymore?
Since my stroke, I try to avoid getting these feet any further off the ground than they are right now.
How about your Oregon motorcycle parts business? What happened to that?
That's been gone since 1982, I think, 81, somewhere in there. In fact, we drove right by where it used to be, and there's now a market there and a high-rise retirement center.
Where was that now?
Landlord, over in Selwood. Yeah.
Where did the parts go?
The parts went into North Portland, and that guy basically gave up. But I left the shop too. He gave up on it a year or 2 later. And,
How about the Christmas tree?
I don't know. I just left it there when I left. It probably went into the pile of rubble when they tore the shop down. Was there a hand back there?
Yeah, who does the calendar art? Are they here?
No, they're not here. I should have invited them. They're nice people. They've done a lot of our shirts over the years. Basically, for doing calendars, we take an old picture of Ross doing something, and for instance, we've got one where Ross is standing like this, wearing a pair of pants with his hands on his shoulders, or on his hips, and we put him on the moon so he looks like Superman. That's the first pair of pants he made, 1947. But anyway, we've got lots of pictures, and we just keep cranking out calendars, most of them related to old pictures, but some of them are totally unrelated. Yes?
I'd like to thank you on behalf of the club for the raffle handouts over the years and the calendars you've given us. It's been great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. It is a pleasure giving you those things, and we'll continue giving you those things. Calendars, if anybody ever wants a calendar, just stop by the shop. They've always got them. And they've got lots of back issues of the calendar. In other words, old issues, if you like the artwork. In fact, before I answer you, and don't let me forget, I was down visiting somebody in an old folks home down in Lincoln City, and they said, yeah, the guy across the hall knows something about you folks, and he's got stuff hanging on his wall. And I went in there, there's about 4 or 5 calendars that he'd pinned up in his bedroom. And he was an old Sidewinders racer, and had lots of our stuff.
Retirement home?
Yeah, he can barely walk. He must be 85, 90, I don't know. Now, it's your turn.
Can you tell us about Levi Strauss?
I don't know what I'm supposed to tell you. I don't know much about it.
Ross proposed that he make his pants and name him after Levi.
I've never heard that story. And there's a lot of stories that have spread about Ross. Some are true, some are less true, and I don't know if that's true or not. A couple things regarding that. We get in people, or we used to, I don't know anymore because they're probably pretty old, but we've had definitely more than one person that have had the first pair of Langlitz pants. One guy claimed that he used to go out with Ross and herd cattle in eastern Oregon so they get the leather for the pants. Herds horses, I think, not cattle. Anyway, you know the stories are a little bit confused, but we've heard them all. Now, is there another question?
How many break-ins have you had in your shop?
Oh. Even before I got married, we were in there one night. We had a machine that was faulty and had hurt one of the employees, so I made a little safety device, very simple thing. Went in there with Jackie one night. Well, we went out to eat and then went over and glued this thing on. It just took a spot of glue to glue it. And something was wrong. The heating grate on the ceiling was on the floor and dusting around and all. And it was kind of strange, but it just fell off, you know. For some reason, we heard a noise. So I'm sitting at this machine, and I went over on the other side of the counter, and I looking around, and I pull back some leathers, and here's a mannequin laying down there. And Jackie says, "What is it?" I said, "Oh, it looks like a mannequin." And I looked at her, and she said, she had locked the door, but left the keys in it, which is real common, instead of putting the keys in her pocket. So she got on the phone, and I was out by the till, and this guy jumped over and grabbed the keys and got out the door and lost the keys. I mean, threw the keys out in the street. By the time the cops got there, they found the keys. But that was the first one I experienced. She'd actually got held up by a guy with a gun a year or two earlier than that. We've had a couple people try to drive through. In fact, remember when they built the convention center? They opened it up and they had this big party where everybody could come to it. And I went down there and walking around, and I see this company that's selling bars, you know, for doors and windows and things. And I thought, boy, that's what we need, because our front door was kind of flimsy. I thought, well, yeah, we need that. So I ordered it, and they installed it. And about 2 or 3 months later, somebody tried to drive their truck through there, and they couldn't break it in, but I couldn't get in either. If anybody knows Gene Brown, I call up on a Sunday morning, and I'm thinking, there's no way I'm going to find anybody. You know, this happened like 4 o'clock Sunday morning. I'm not going to find anybody that can help me, and I can't even get in the place. You know, we did get in finally by forcing it, but I called his number, and sure enough, he was there. He was going to go out golfing with his buddies, and he came over with a torch and got us all fixed up till Monday. But that was the first time they tried to break through the expensive doors, and then they tried it again 10 years later, I suppose. Somebody tried to drive through the doors. But those things happen. A lot of crooks in the world. Any other questions? Yes?
Have you ever had orders for exotic leathers?
Whenever people come, to answer your question, yeah, we had a guy that wanted fish leather. He was going to buy salmon up in Alaska and have them tanned and wanted to make jackets out of them. We get people every once in a while that has this weird idea, and we've learned long ago it's better just to say, boy, thanks for considering us, but we're the wrong company. And even when it gets into styles and fashion stuff, a lot of people want fashion leathers, and quite often we just politely say, no, you know, we make traditional motorcycle leathers. And it's hard to draw a line, because we sell a lot of things that are somewhat fashionable, but there reaches a point where you just can't deal with all the weird stuff that people want. And even if you were to deal with it, when you build it for them, what they can imagine is not what you can build. So it just almost never works out.
No bikini leathers then, huh?
No, but we could suggest where you could go to get them. You probably know all those places already, don't you?
How about kinky leather guys from Colorado?
Yeah, you're friends. That's right. Any other questions? Thank you very much. It's been a very encouraging.
I just wanted to say thank you very much to the Elks Lodge. Your service has been great. The food was terrific. We really appreciate what you've done for us. And I also wanted to make sure everybody knows that this was organized within the club by Ron Saunders. Those of you who remember, perhaps somewhat painfully, our previous banquets at the Top Hat, High Hat, know how much better this is. So I think we should give Ron a nice round of applause. Thank you. And basically, that's it. That's all, folks. See you next time.
You kept inching closer though, so I don't know how much of it. Yeah.